delay there. My name is Ian Whittaker. I'm the Director of Strategic Content at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And on behalf of the Council, thank you all for joining us this evening. Please know that we're on the record, we're live streaming this event, and please silence your phones before we begin. For nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent and non-partisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper global understanding and active US engagement in the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Thank you to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you're not a member, please consider joining. We have a wide range of levels for you to choose from. This evening's discussion will be followed by an audience Q&A. You can raise your hand. We have microphones in the room. You can also submit your question online. Just go to your browser and type chi.cnf.io, and that link is up on the rotating bio. Just very briefly, our speakers tonight are, in the far seat, we have Paul Stairs. He's the General John W. Vesey's Senior Fellow for Conflict Prevention and Director of the Center for Preventive Action at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously was the Vice President and Director of the Center for Conflict Analysis and Prevention at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And his new book, Preventive Engagement, How America Can Avoid War, Stay Strong, and Keep the Peace, will be available from our friends at the bookseller this evening, just over there. Next to Paul is Bruce Jentleson. He is a Professor of Public Policy and Political Science at Duke University. He's also a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's a leading scholar on U.S. foreign policy and has served in a number of policy and political positions, including Senior Advisor to the U.S. State Department Policy Planning Director. And Professor Jentleson's new book, The Peacemakers, Leadership Lessons from 20th Century Statesmanship, is also available for sale and signing this evening. And moderating the conversation is Cecile Shea. Cecile is a non-resident senior fellow on global security and diplomacy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She's also a special advisor to the Council's next generation programs. She's the president of Wakaru Communications, and she's a former US diplomat with over 2 decades of service across the world. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you very much, and welcome to those of you who are here and to those watching remotely. And welcome to Chicago, to both of you. Sorry that at least one of you did not have a positive experience at O'Hare Airport a few hours ago, but we'll try to make it up to you today. Goes with the territory. That's right. So really outstanding books dealing with perhaps the most important question of our age, which is how can we create a more secure future for our children, not just our children here in the US, but really children everywhere. So I thought we would start by asking each of you to give a small summary of what you argue in your book. So Paul, maybe we can start with you. Preventive engagement, how America can avoid war, stay strong, and keep the peace. Sounds like a really important idea. So how can we do that?
So thanks for having me here today. It's a great pleasure to be here, getting some feedback. So what I set out to do with this book was to try to figure out how the United States could best manage the various geopolitical risks that were increasing in recent years, rising rivalry with major powers like China and Russia, how to deal with the eruption of instability around the world that could draw us in and lead to more military engagement in places that we frankly don't want to be, and how to deal with non-state actors. And these sort of 3 major challenges I saw as being a real source of long-term instability and a great risk to the United States in drawing us in, and very much informed by how much we had spent over the last 10, 15 years in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. We're already up to, nearly $1 trillion now, and 4,000 Americans dead, and many tens of thousands mortally wounded. So the whole idea was, how can we deal with this without getting drawn into expensive conflicts? We do want to focus on putting our domestic priorities straight and to deal with issues at home. We don't want to be drawn into expensive conflicts. And I was, frankly, unhappy or dissatisfied with the usual prescriptions, which is we either do more, we have a stronger military, peace through strength, and frankly, that didn't really strike me as being a compelling, in fact, frankly, quite dangerous in many respects. The alternative is pulling back, It's doing less. It's sort of more restrained, calibrated. But that also came with a lot of risks. And I characterize both those alternatives as supply-side strategies. And what I laid out here was what I called a demand-side strategy. It's about reducing the demand for US power through a comprehensive, deliberate effort to reduce sources of instability, both in the distant future, doing things that we know can actually lessen the risk of international and civil conflict, while also looking ahead to the near future and trying to anticipate where sources of instability and conflict could really draw in the United States and become a very costly engagement, and developing strategies for dealing with those specific contingencies. And then also managing the present, because you can't ignore what's going on now while you're thinking about the future. So it's this three-layered strategy, and it's very much informed by the approach that we take with other public policy challenges, violent crime, infectious disease, pregnancy, all kinds of things, alcoholism. It's this very much this preventive strategy that is used with great success elsewhere. And so I applied it to how would we use that approach for managing our national security challenges. So I lay out a whole kind of prescription there for that.
And very clearly, and I think in a very compelling way. One of my big fears is one of these mornings I'm going to wake up, as we all do, grab my iPad, look at Twitter, and find out that President Trump has decided to pull the bulk of our forces out of Europe and Japan. And it's not unthinkable that he would do something like that.
It's totally not unthinkable.
So what would that do to U.S. national security now and in the future?
I think it would be very short-sighted, very dangerous. It would send tremors throughout the world, frankly, about our commitment, our willingness to stand by our commitments and solemn responsibilities that we've taken over the last 70 years. It's not that we should have forces there should be there forever and ever, and that the host nation shouldn't do their part to pay for them. In fact, they do. But to sort of preemptively just pull back without a larger effort to manage the situation that required them being there in the first place is just very short-sighted and dangerous.
Thank you. And Bruce, in an age when political scientists seem to be focused on quantitative data, you, I am happy to see, have taken a refreshing old school and powerful approach, which is looking at case studies and actual individuals, the ways that individuals can affect history. So tell us a little bit about your book, if you don't mind.
Sure, happy to. Let me join Paul in expressing thanks to the Chicago Council for this invitation. And picking up what you said, Cecile, about getting up in the morning, I mean, after I turn on the coffee, given the nature of the news, the first thing I do is actually check out my fantasy baseball team, right? Which, by the way, has a number of Chicago Cubs on it. No White Sox, but it has a bunch of Cubs on it. Part of my thinking on this book was when we think about where we were in the 1990s, there was a degree, somewhat false, sense of euphoria. The Cold War had ended peacefully. There wasn't even a Soviet Union anymore. Democracy seemed to be spreading around the world. Globalization seemed to be providing winners everywhere. And a whole variety of other things that we all felt, pretty good about. And then you turn around, well before the current situation, but in the 2000s, we've had, not a new Cold War, but very tense relations with Russia. The U.S. relation with China is complex. Democracy is not spreading. Indeed, it's receding. If you look at the Freedom House, the last year in which they showed measures of democracy spreading was 2005. Globalization obviously has people who are and feel that they have been losers, thus Brexit, thus part of the Trump vote. And a whole variety of other things. Global pandemics, is more of a threat, climate change. And so I started thinking about, the ways in which these issues can seem intractable. Where could we look back in the 20th century and see major breakthroughs were made on issues that at that time seemed very intractable, that if you'd gone to Las Vegas, you would have gotten great odds that things wouldn't happen. And so I look at a whole variety of issues in the 20th century, from the end of the Cold War and Gorbachev to the breakthrough in US-China relations to the spread of human rights and sustainability, a variety of things. And try to see what the strategies were, not that you could surgically extract those, but A, for the inspiration and belief that it had been done once before and we could tackle these problems, and B, to derive some lessons for that. And then within that, to really look, as you were saying, at the role of leadership. We talk about leadership all the time. You know, you go into any bookstore, not just mine, but there's whole shelves of books on leadership. You know, in the private sector, I think I say in the book, I did a Google and I got 191,000 titles or something on leadership. And so we have a fascination with it, but also a frustration about what are the elements. And I don't profess to have come up with sort of a secret sauce magic formula here, but I look at the role that individuals played. And you know, in breakthroughs and turning points in history, it really is about individuals. So to take the fantasy baseball a little further, you know, there is that statistic, wins against replacement player. How many wins does this shortstop contribute to their team compared to every other shortstop in baseball? Lots of stats go into it. So that's called WARP. I use what I call SARLs, statesman against replacement leader. And acknowledge that any statesman needs conducive conditions and faces constraints, but also has a domain of choice, and in every case make an argument that this particular leader made choices and did things that other leaders wouldn't have done. And so it gets us looking at the important role that leadership has. None of these cases, while it's called The Peacemakers, are perfect peace. That'd be a very thin book. But all were breakthroughs which resolved or laid the basis for more progress. And sometimes there's been backlash and backsliding. And so in the book, I both tell these stories, draw out lessons, and then try to apply them to 21st century issues. Not so much pointing to individuals, but what strategies can you use in major power geopolitics, in advancing freedom and human rights, in promoting global sustainability and the like.
And I want to ask you a question about that in a moment, but I have a very practical question,
Yeah.
having read the book. I would have expected Anwar Sadat's name to be in there, and I wonder why it wasn't.
So it's very interesting. I was giving a talk in London, and they asked me about the founding of the European Union. And so there are two answers to that. One is a very practical answer from my publisher that said, you know, if you want to keep going with all these cases, go to a university press. Don't come to W.W. Norton. And so I had to make some trade-offs. And so in my view, I chose the Rabin to get at the peace process. And in none of these cases is it just the individual, but it's the individual that's the focus of it. And I actually had a chapter going on Sadat. I had one on Schumann, Monet, and Adenauer. And so I'm very careful to say these are representative examples of the kind of leadership and statesmanship that I have. So you're absolutely right, and I wanted to have it. And we can debate whether or not I made the right choice between Rabin and Sadat, but that was part of the, part of the way of making the book work.
So you have one of your commentary sections is on what I would call tribalism. I think you used a much more elegant terminology. But what can leadership do today as we see the rise in ethnocentrism and some of the scary things happening in our own country?
Yeah, I call it the politics of identity, of who I am, who you are, and what the differences are between us. And the issues in Paul's book, take that further, and why those differences are a reason for me to kill you before you kill me in terms of a lot of the ethnic conflicts. And so I have 3 different cases that I look at in that section, each one very different. One is Mandela, sort of the iconic case. And again, if we go back and think about what were the odds that someone who'd been a political prisoner for 27 years would come out thinking reconciliation, not retribution. And that would, if you look at the polling at the time on Afrikaner views of Mandela, they're very frightened of him. And so what were the qualities that he had that were able to do that? And for all of my profiles, I do this who, why, how, and what. Who were they as people? In all of the cases, I find that there's an important thing called personal capital, this authenticity and courage that they bring to it. In Mandela's case, it had a lot of morality. What's the vision that they provide, both to their supporters and their opponents, to bring them along? And then where are the political skills? And Mandela's skills were in the reconciliation. He, maybe like George Washington, knew that he shouldn't stay, as president. And South Africa has huge problems, but it made the transition. Second one is on Rabin, and the title of that chapter is Soldier as Peacemaker. How he went from the Minister of Defense in the first Intifada, breaking wrists, breaking knuckles, to seeing, as he once put it, that there is no guarantee that peace with the Palestinians will bring Israel security, but there is no way we can have security without peace. And the extraordinary role he played. Shimon Peres comes in, Arafat comes in to a certain extent, Bill Clinton comes in. But you know, in the end, in terms of the political skills, there's an expression I actually take from the broad leadership literature, which is controlling the temperature and keeping the opposition close. He failed to do that. You know, he was told by the Shin Bet to wear a bulletproof vest. He couldn't believe that a countryman would try to assassinate him. The third case is very different. I look at two Northern Irish women named Mairead Corrigan and Betty Williams, who were everyday people. One was a secretary at a Guinness brewery. At the height of the killings in Northern Ireland in 1972 to 76, the Troubles, there was an incident where Mairead Corrigan's sister and children were hit by an IRA getaway car being chased by the British police. And she walks out of the hospital and she makes a statement to BBC. And what we today went viral, right? No social media, something about it. The reporter who'd been through a lot of this starts crying. And a whole variety of things happens. This movement called the Northern Ireland Women for Peace gets formed. It takes another 20 years and people like George Mitchell to bring the Good Friday Agreement. But the killings never went back to the 1976 level. And so I try to use them as an example of peacemaking and leadership that comes from civil society, if you will. And what were the qualities? And their qualities ran out, too, for the next stage. They kind of were moved out of the movement, but they provided the inspiration that got it going.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the power of a person in the right place at the right time who shows courage.
Yeah.
So, Paul, can you give the president a grade on North Korea thus far?
An overall grade. Well, I think he has to be credited for turning down the heat, and you know, given where we were back in November or December.
But who had turned up the heat?
Well, he had certainly contributed it, but let's not forget what the North Koreans were doing.
Sure.
They were being extremely aggressive in terms of their nuclear weapons test program, their ballistic missile test program, their rhetoric. So we shouldn't give them a free pass. Now, Trump, I think, was adding to it. You know, in terms of style, I would say a C-. We went through this extraordinarily convoluted, on again, off again kind of process to get to the summit in Singapore. You know, it's hard to grade what came out of it because it's frankly the agreement has so many questions about what does this mean, when is it going to happen, who's going to take the lead, who goes first. How will you verify it? What kind of confidence? There's so much. So it's really, frankly, hard to give it a grade. But we can't ignore the fact that the temperature has been turned down, and there's now an opportunity to possibly move ahead and build on this. Secretary Pompeo has his work cut out for him. I do worry that it's come at some cost in our relationship with South Korea and Japan, who wonder, you know, what does this mean? We seem to be, you know, happy with no more testing of intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the U.S., but they're still living with the threat of nuclear.
That's been Japan's fear all
Absolutely.
along, right? That we would throw them under the bus.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so they have to be wondering about this. Trump offering to end what he called provocative war games, also not a useful way to describe what we've been doing for the last 50 years on the Korean Peninsula as, you know, essential for the defense of the Republic of Korea. So that also wasn't reassuring to South Koreans. Now, you know, on the sidelines, there's China and Russia who must be thinking, well, this could be the beginning of the end of the U.S. forward engagement in the Western Pacific, and so they may be thinking the fuse has been lit for eventual pullback of U.S. forces from South Korea and Japan, with no real change in the threat from North Korea. So we've got a lot of work to do before I think we can really reach some definitive judgment about whether this summit actually, frankly, achieved anything.
And we should say those military exercises serve, there are two major ones a year and some smaller ones.
Absolutely.
They serve a number of purposes.
Sure.
And losing those sends a message of what to countries? I mean, you know, the fact that the exercises apparently are not going to occur at least for a while now. What are the messages?
It has to be disquieting that, just as, he can end the U.S. commitment to the Paris Climate Accords, to the JCPOA, the Iran agreement on a whim, more or less, and now more or less, if not cancel, at least postpone exercises on the beach. People must question, what is the level of U.S. commitment now to commitments they've made, and so to me that's very troubling.
And I also worry it sends a message to people who watch these things closely, including Kim Jong-il, but that President Trump doesn't understand how militaries operate and why they train together.
I don't think he understands the importance of alliances, the fundamental role of our alliance network that's been built up and nurtured over many decades.
The fact that he didn't consult with South Korea before announcing that he was going to suspend the exercises.
To him, it's just an economic burden. We're being ripped off.
Yeah.
He doesn't see the value for our security, for regional stability, and reassuring allies in places of the world which are still quite, dangerous. And so I don't think he gets it.
So you're kind of giving him an incomplete, it sounds like, or a C- in progress.
Certainly in that, yeah.
How about you, C- in progress, or?
Well, let's see. I was actually going to use the incomplete line. I wasn't sure you'd
incomplete.
let me give him an incomplete, but maybe a C or a B for this week's assignment. But the term grade remains incomplete. I woke up about 4 in the morning Eastern time that night and turned on BBC, and I heard President Trump speaking at his press conference. And I wasn't totally awake, but I'm listening, thinking, oh, it actually sounds like they got something accomplished here. And I was actually doing Wisconsin Public Radio the next morning. So when I got up and got my coffee and fantasy baseball scores, I went and printed out the statement and like, what? I mean, you need some sort of roadmap. And so in the book, so I wrote a piece. I'd written a piece a couple days before the summit in foreignpolicy.com, on high-level summitry, looking at my book on Kissinger and Zhou Enlai and Reagan and Gorbachev, and sort of called it the 3 Ps of high-level summitry. You need 3 things to happen. You need to manage your domestic politics. You need common policy ground. And you need some personal rapport, some personal trust, right? And I tried to say before the summit, well, these 2 guys, Trump and Kim, are probably well positioned to manage the domestic politics. The old Nixon goes to China. It's more complex than that, but that. The common policy ground, there was so much ground to close. And and it wasn't going to all be done there. You look at the Shanghai Communique or the Reagan-Gorbachev statements of 85, 87, 88, but there is a bit of a roadmap there. And so in that statement, for 2 examples, one is you had complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Well, does that mean North Korea gives up its weapons, or does it also mean the American nuclear umbrella, which is extended? And to leave that ambiguous is not okay at that point. You've got to really, you can't just say Pompeo and others are going to work out the details. The other, which has already come out, is the sequencing. There are a lot of complications of the invocation of the Libya model, but the Libya 2003 deal, that, by the way, people who were involved in it will tell you was negotiated around John Bolton. It was one of the few successes that Colin Powell and others in the State Department had of keeping him out of it, even though he was now invoking it as a model, and it was done heavily by the British, Tony Blair. There was the Libyans do this in their programs, and they get this suspension of these sanctions. They do that. And so you have the United States now saying that any economic benefits wait the end. Well, the studies, many of you probably saw the studies by Sanford and other experts who've actually seen the program. 10 to 15 years, best case scenario, to take this apart. 10 to 15 years before they get the economic benefits. And Kim immediately made a statement that the Americans agreed to lift sanctions. So those elements left there, while it's good news cycle, in my view, I think is a little bit of a ticking time bomb that I worry about. And the third factor of the personal rapport, you didn't expect sort of this intellectual engagement that Kissinger and Zhou Enlai had, or the genuine warmth that Reagan and Gorbachev had. But we know, and coming out of the G7, if you're Kim, and this is the way Trump treats his friends, and the personality profiles with the limited knowledge of Kim, he's used to command and everything else. So I actually worry that we could be in a scenario in which, combined with other things, that you could see a big disappointment if it started to create political problems created with other factors, say like the Mueller investigation, and the impetuousness that Donald Trump has in this mix of thin skin and bully, frankly, that we could go back to, Rocket Man and what was Kim's word, dotard, in a way that might lead us to think that we would have been better if this never happened. Now, maybe that won't happen, but there have been a whole bunch of things left that really make me worry about where it's going.
So you talk a lot in your book about, and those of you who are military veterans will recognize greatest risk versus most likely, right? So most dangerous versus most likely.
Consequential and likelihood, yeah.
Exactly. So we have to give President Trump credit, I think. He's taken a big gambit trying to tamp down what would be a very dangerous kind of future. Do you care to wager what the most likely scenario is for the next 6 months?
Oh, I think where I worry the most is this deteriorating relationship with Iran and the fact that we could be drawn into something through the actions of Israel with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon or Syria itself. Our relationship with Turkey is very poor, and we could be drawn into something in defense of our Kurdish partners in Syria and northern Iraq, and so to
Which
me,
would throw NATO into a tailspin.
Absolutely. So this could resonate in all kinds of very destabilizing, dangerous fashion. And so to me, I'm probably most worried about this unfolding situation, the deteriorating relationship between the Gulf Sunni states and Iran, and we no longer, or at least we could look at the nuclear agreement as something to build on, but now that's going away. So I think it's a very incendiary situation. That probably is my number one concern. I can point to other places around the planet too, but
I agree with that. My comments on North Korea, I think it's in the president's interest to get through the midterms. And to the extent that he has a degree of control of whether it unravels on North Korea, my thinking is more after the midterms and other factors. But Paul's point about Iran, that may be something you have to react to, and that could be more short and medium-term explosive.
Trump has been lucky. He hasn't had to face a really serious crisis. Now, okay, he's had the chemical use in Syria, and he's responded with the use of cruise missiles, but not a really serious crisis that has immediate national security implications for the U.S. And he's been quite lucky in not having to face that so far.
And in particular, a crisis where we had to rely on cooperation with our allies, who might not be, as you pointed out, quite as interested in working with us this time. So we have a couple minutes left before we go to questions. I want you both to put your professor's hats on and imagine that you can specify for the next president-elect, vice president-elect, and congressional delegation-elect a fall reading list to read between November and January that will help them to know the ways to make our world more secure. And so can you give us 3 to 5...
Apart from our own books.
Yeah,
apart from your own book, which I
one.
highly recommend and which will be available with signatures at the table directly after this while the bar will be open. So, but yes, I think about this a lot, frankly. What would I tell people they should read to prepare for a job like that? So what would you recommend?
So I'd probably put them into several genres rather than specific books and let the person choose. So I think one genre are these fabulous award-winning biographies of previous U.S. presidents who've had to face adversity, whether it's Washington, Grant and Lincoln, Truman, Eisenhower, and there was just some wonderful set of books that won Pulitzer Prizes, and pick any one, and that will, I think, inform the person of the challenges, the need for in some cases compromised, for statesmanship, for foresight, and so on. A second genre probably would be books about disasters in international relations and learning from why do we continue to make mistakes. And
kind of Guns of August type books.
I can think, the more recent one, The Sleepwalkers, the Chris Clark one about the First World War. It's a terrific book. Best and the Brightest about Vietnam, still a classic, right?
Yes.
There's been ones written about the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and which are also terrific too, about perils of groupthink and so on.
Fiasco, I think, was one of the books. Yeah.
And then I think the third genre would be books about these huge challenges that are now in front of us. Whether it's climate change, and there's several books about what's coming down the road there, and frankly, it's not much. We can manage it at the margins, but these are big challenges. The AI revolution, the artificial intelligence revolution. I saw some piece about what's on Xi Jinping's reading list, and two of them were about artificial intelligence. And I'm thinking, is Trump really reading up on AI at the moment? So that would be it. And to say nothing of some bigger ones about the social divisions in this country and the challenges to the future of work. These are big issues, and so I wouldn't want to pick specific ones, but certainly those three genres would be the ones I would encourage the person to read.
I would sleep better at night thinking that all 535 folks in the Congress had read from those genres. So thank you. That's great. How about you?
So I would, along the lines of biographies, if I had to choose one, I would do James McGregor Burns' Lion and the Fox about FDR. He wrote, I think it's 3 volumes. But that whole, it's taken from Machiavelli, but the whole notion of the way that FDR, had these skill sets, and who, by the way, came from an elite, had his own experiences with his polio. But I think about political skills, and anything like that you got to translate to 21st century. But I think it really gets at aspects of his leadership, and also leads into at least what it was like to talk to the country on December 7th or 8th, 1941. It's coming out of depression and mobilize the country. And I tell people that when my mother passed away, she grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania, and I found in her papers the letter she got for growing her victory garden, during World War II. She was a young teenager. So that would be one. You had mentioned our correspondence, and I agree, the Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright, because I feel like the Middle East is so complex, and it's probably the best book I know. And when I've done my policy work, I've worked a lot in the Middle East, particularly to get at the roots of political Islam in ways that aren't just the simplistic notions. And there are others, but that would be one. And if the person said, give me something that's a little more academic, a more historian, I would have him read a book by the now Harvard Kennedy School historian Arnie Westad called The Global War, in which he looks at the so-called Third World during the Cold War. And it's a little bit of a bifurcation where you've got John Gaddis's Cold War, which is largely we won, they lost, but it's mostly about the George Kennan arena, Europe, and the like. And you've got, the Third World. It's not that the Soviets had good policies, but whether it's Vietnam or Zaire or Central America, we didn't have a lot of successes there, and we made a lot of bad trade-offs. And to me, the 21st century is full of those kinds of issues. We're focusing a lot on Russia and China now, as we should, sort of classical major power politics. But much of what we do is, is versions of nationalism, versions of this mix of identity and culture. And I think that that's a really good study, because we tend to think singularly about the Cold War. And I actually think we didn't do so well in the Third World, even though we did well, overall in Europe. Those would be at least 3 different. I was trying to think of a novel too, but I was going to say All the King's Men, but I don't think that's right. So someday I'll think of the right political novel for the day.
Or play, Macbeth. That would
there
be
you
terrific.
go. I think they've all read that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. I think, and when I create a list, it usually has many of those same books. And the only other one that I think of off the top of my head is the Nelson Mandela Long Walk to Freedom.
Yeah.
Because it's just, and I think every high school student should read that book. If I was king of the world, that's what I would do. But it's so wonderful, and it's inspiring, and it's an example of leadership at its most outstanding. And you spoke about that earlier. So we have a couple minutes. So before we go into questions, Actually, I'm just going to go into questions a little early, and then if we have a couple minutes left, I have one last one. But sir, you have a question right here. Please wait for the microphone. And if you could try to keep your questions concise and with an actual question mark at the end of them,
Okay.
That would be helpful to everyone.
Okay, thank you. I'm back to leadership. In David Brooks' column today, he talks about the rise of authoritarian dictators like Putin, President Xi, Kim Jong-un, and the fact that Trump seems very enamored with that model. And he laments at the end of his op-ed piece that there is no democratic leadership alternative on the horizon. Why do you think the world is confronted with this choice or lack of choices, and do you see any resolution to it?
So on the second point, I don't know. You know, a lot of times the leadership emerges and it wasn't seen coming, right? A number of the examples I talk about in my book, you know, were like that. So I don't know that I agree with that part. And I think that, you know, there's a lot in the United States that's happening at the state, local level. There's a lot happening in the civil society world. It, you know, doesn't supplant political leadership, but, you know, the role of the chapter on philanthropy, statesmanship. So, but the first point, I think, is the ways in which I think what we're seeing today, you know, it didn't start in 2016 either with the Brexit vote or Trump's electoral victory. You know, the roots of that go deeper. And I had written just an op-ed in the spring of 2016, and I called it the witch's brew. And I said, if you look across all Western democracies today, you saw three factors at work. One was the sense of economic dislocation, and it was feeding both the left and the right. You know, some Trump voters had actually voted for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary, right, particularly in the Rust Belt. Groups in Europe, like Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain, as well as more of the right-wing groups, that both were responding to economic dislocation. Secondly was this cultural anxiety, right? We're seeing it in our country, you know, race issues, immigration issues, Muslim issues. And in Europe, in some countries, it's the Syrian refugees, but in Britain and France, it's the legacy, you know, of colonialism that hadn't been resolved, and the anxiety that it creates in people about identity and culture. And third was terrorism, you know, in the various homelands. And it struck me that this was happening in almost every country, manifesting itself differently. Here we had Trump, Britain, they had Brexit, France, they had Le Pen for a while. In Denmark, that nice little social democracy, the second largest party in parliament is an anti-immigrant party. So I think what we're seeing in this manifestation of authoritarianism is some trends that have been developing for a long time, in which people feel a variety of factors that's leading them to look for the appeal of the psychology of fear, blaming others, and that's the common pattern that has different particular manifestations, and that's what it is. So I think it's been brewing for a long time, and we really need to deal with it at the roots as well as at the stuff that's above ground.
I didn't read the piece, but it's not as if there are not leaders who have an enlightened vision of their own country and the international community that are not out there. Macron, I think, has articulated a very compelling vision. Trudeau, Merkel is, I think, still you know, very strong in terms of her principles and what she stands for. So it's not as if there are no alternatives. It's, you know, their challenge is much greater. You know, autocrats don't have to answer to their electorate. They don't have to manage a free press or answer to a free press. So, you know, their challenge, the bar is much, much higher for them to govern than it is for these authoritarian leaders. And, you know, maybe rather than looking for specific individuals, we should looking for sort of a collective leadership coming out of the West that can collectively reaffirm some of the core tenets of, I think, what most of us would believe in is the way forward. And rather than looking for the shining knight that's going to lead the charge going forward, maybe it's something, some collective vision from the leaders that clearly share these views.
And in 1931, no one knew FDR was going to turn out to be FDR, right? And save American society, as Studs Terkel used to describe it, and really save democracy for a great part of the globe.
Obama came out of nowhere. So,
Yeah. So I'm trying to be optimistic. That was a great question.
He came
But
out
in
of
some ways,
Chicago, so
Churchill did too. We
Nowhere.
forget.
Oh, that's true. Good point. Yeah.
Churchill was a match of person and moment. You know, many of the things he did before, he wasn't particularly successful, but his personality and leadership fit the 1939 moment, 37, and then in 1945, after this great war victory, the British vote him out of office. So sometimes it comes from directions that weren't foreseen. You look back and say, oh, now I see why there was this match between this particular leader and the moment.
Interesting. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I was wondering whether you foresee any possibility that at a certain point, if the current White House's approach to international relations moves to a point where it appears to be seriously endangering our security, the U.S. military might consider intervening in some form. I will not use the word that would be obvious, but some form. Is that even something that you foresee as a distinct possibility?
There's a great movie about that.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen it, 7 Days in May.
7 Days in May,
Which
yeah.
I've told my kids to watch it, but I frankly don't see that happening. Some people would say the presence of people like Secretary Mattis is a restraint on President Trump, and that's the real influence of the military coming through. But in terms of a coup, I think that's very unlikely.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's funny because 7 Days in May, I saw as a kid, and it was like, the fear of a military intervention. And now people have started to think maybe it's our salvation, right? So that the discussion of that has changed. I think there's too many constraints on that. And I also think that, there is this ambiguous notion, because it's never been tested, of what the 25th Amendment is all about. But that's not just the military. I'll plug your event next week. You have Elliot Cohen coming, right? And Elliot, who's a friend and colleague of a lot of us, has been very outspoken. He worked closely with the Bush administration. He's a Republican. He's a conservative. And he's been very critical of what he started to call the enablers, people who've gone into the administration who think that they can be a restraint, and he feels they're enabling. So if you're coming whatever night that is, it would be good to get Elliot's views on not just that particular question, but more generally what folks who are genuinely conservative and Republicans feel about the current situation.
And he spent most of his career working with the military, teaching them in Newport, so he would have insight there too. We'll take another question, and I'll come back. Yes, let's see, is there a woman with her hand up anywhere? Come on,
Yeah.
baby. Oh, there we go, right there.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, wait for the mic, please.
The question that I think is on many persons' mind is, of course, immigration, but then we are urged to go back and look at American policy toward Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua. Are there any thoughts that might, in fact, unite the Congress in a policy switch in those areas?
Some of that relates to the book I mentioned, The Global Cold War, and 1954 covertive intervention in Guatemala and other sorts. I think there is this sense that what we're seeing, and the same is true in North Africa, in Syria, and elsewhere, is, and this is the paradox of the 21st century, we are so interconnected by globalization, in terms of information technology, in terms of disease spread, in terms of economics, and in terms of people flows, that we can't really shield ourselves from those. Yet at the same time, Merkel and others are trying to figure out what's the right policy, should you just be open? So you could see in many respects the consequences of the problems that Central America has had for many years. I would add, though, that it's important, while I'm critical of many of U.S. policies during the Cold War there, these countries also contributed to their own problems by their own political malpractice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we don't want to take it too far and say it's only us getting our just desserts. It's really a mix of the two.
I think you point to an inconvenient but unavoidable truth, that unless you go upstream to deal with the source of this problem, then you're just going to be putting Band-Aids on it constantly. And so without some concerted effort to deal with the sources of conflict and instability, violence, drug trafficking, gangs, and so on in Central America, this problem ain't going to go away. And the idea that we can build walls and fences to deal with it, forget it. And the same goes for the EU. You know, I was stunned by how slow the EU was to understand the risk of the situation in Syria. And we do an annual survey each year trying to anticipate sources of conflict and what the consequences were. And one year, this was probably 2013, we anticipated increased migration flows from Syria and the political instability that might cause in Europe. And I remember briefing this to officials in the EU, and they looked at this, where did you get this from? And I said, you know, I'm surprised you're even asking this question, because it was damn obvious that as the situation deteriorated in Syria, that the refugee camps outside on the immediate region became saturated, that they would move on. And the logical place is Europe. And that they didn't anticipate this is frankly stunning. But unless you go to the source, the problem ain't going to go away. And that's a big problem, a costly problem.
Excellent question, excellent answers. Thank you. Ma'am.
So one topic that hasn't really been explored this evening, and is my greatest fear, is a potential cyber threat by a state actor. So is that something that you can discuss a little bit, where we should be concerned?
Well, it's a huge problem, obviously. I think there's not a person in this room that hasn't been hacked or had their email messed with or other things happen to email and so on. So, and there is no obvious solution in terms of using traditional tools of national security, deterrence, and offense. These things don't kind of translate easily into this new realm, because there's not just states doing it, there's non-state actors. You don't know really who's behind it. You know, people blame China for doing certain things, or North Korea. Is that the behest of the leadership? Is it some faction? Is it someone pretending to be North Korea? You know, it's very, very difficult. And I think that the best that we can hope for is to develop some sort of understandings, if that's the right term. Some people call them norms of behavior amongst some of the key players, not to do certain things, a sort of reciprocal restraint, mutually observed, in which we don't agree, we agree to not interfere with our national command authority systems, our nuclear weapons command and control systems, that we maybe don't interfere with the political voting systems in countries, and that there's some agreement just not to go there, and there's sort of broad rules of the road. Because I just don't see how we can get formal kind of arms control agreements here. And the best we can do, I think, is make sure our systems are robust, resilient, redundant, so they don't fail catastrophically. I think that's the obvious thing we can do, but also, as I say, maybe reach some sort of general rules of the road with key players, not to do certain things.
Yeah, I think it's really, you know, I agree with a lot of what Paul said. I actually was chairing one of the foreign policy groups for the Hillary Clinton campaign, and I don't do a lot of Facebook, but I noticed every second day my Facebook was going down. I was getting a message, somebody tried to get into your account, and I'd put it back up, and it'd go down and go down, and then at one point I sent a message to a friend, and when I sent it and hit send, and that person got it, it was all in Cyrillic. So, and I don't know Cyrillic, and I don't have it on my computer. So it was an interesting experience. I think the notion, you know, there were some efforts to say, let's think about this like classical deterrence, like Paul was saying, and it's not quite the same thing. But maybe you do get to a point where you have this mutual assured disruption, you know, among governments, but you still have at least a couple levels of problems. One is some of this has come like from North Korea, and others. And in some ways, we're not surprised that Russia's developed this capability. They, after all, the Cold War developed great scientific capability for nuclear weapons. But when it was North Korea that hacked Sony, it was like, wait, I thought they still weren't that developed. And so how do you get all of the parties in? And then there's the other level of not just governments. Right? Think back to the Stieg Larsson novels and the character Wasp, who was out there hacking everything out there. Even if you had agreement among the major countries, how do you get other countries to buy in? And how do you prevent the hacking by just hackers? And none of us know the answers to that. The concern is that we'll continue to pile on resources and money, just thinking that more gets us there. And we're going to need some very savvy thinking there. And I'm not a techie person, but I think it's extremely complicated because it's not, with nuclear weapons in the Cold War, we knew who had them, right? And so if you had an agreement, you had some degree of confidence in it. It's not true with hacking.
Interesting question. This side. We'll take two simultaneously, one right after the other. So the gentleman with the poppy and then the gentleman in the burgundy sweater, okay?
Being advocates for peace, do you have a personal scenario where preventive action is justifiable for the conflict, or where war is the right answer in order to get to peace?
Okay, so preventive war, preventive action. And sir, your question?
My question is related. Yesterday, I believe, Italy had turned away a ship of asylum seekers and was very vocal about it. And one of the coalition partners in Germany of Chancellor Merkel came out very strongly in favor of what Italy had done. And I wonder whether or not that immigration issue is going to be a greater and greater issue in the EU.
Both good questions. So you can take either or both.
On the use of force for preventive action, I think there are circumstances where the use of force may be necessary and legitimate, and we shouldn't foreclose that. I would even subscribe to the notion that force shouldn't be a last resort, too. Just as police forces are not beholden to some sense that they won't use tough tactics early to quell a particular situation. I think the same applies elsewhere. I think there are real legitimate questions how force should be used, the circumstances, and that it not be used indiscriminately, that you make every effort to do so in as I say, a legitimate fashion. To me, there are similarities with the privacy that we give property holders, that you don't breach the sanctity of public property or private property at will. You need a warrant from a legal authority to do so. But there are sometimes instances where the house is on fire, or the husband's beating up the wife, where the police can intervene. And there are rules of doing that and checks and balances. And I think the same can be developed for the use of force by states to deal with certain problems that are rising in another country. We're just too interdependent to hide behind this notion that what goes on there ain't gonna potentially affect us down the road. So yeah, there are circumstances, and sometimes going early is better than late.
And the other question was political instability. We'll come back to you in a second. Political instability caused by the immigration crisis in Europe, particularly in the EU.
The German chancellor's response versus one of her coalition partner major persons and the asylum seekers. And there seems to be a great disparity between many of the northern European countries versus the southern tier entirely.
Yeah,
they're the frontier states in many respects. And we've seen the backlash in Italy recently, politically, as a result of immigration. It's having an effect in Eastern Europe, and this is probably one of the biggest challenges facing the EU at the moment in terms of maintaining its political cohesion. And when they're not on the same script here, it makes it harder. And as you say, you pointed to just one country's division, but it's right across Europe.
Yeah, in fact, it was not only a member of the coalition, it was her Minister of the Interior, which has particular responsibility, that which made it even more profound, especially after the difficulties she had in forming a government. You know, that's what Brexit was about. It was this mix, I was saying before, between the cultural, you know, issues and identity and the economic. So in Britain, you know, for a number of years, they would refer to what they called the Polish plumber, right? You know, which was their way of saying it was partly the expansion of the EU and these, you know, people that come in and work underwage for what, you know, what plumbers and unions and others got. And so it wasn't just, you know, Pakistani and, you know, and others. So there was this building up of the resentment of immigration. And in Spain, you saw it because a lot of the North African immigration was getting into Spain even before, you know, it came out of Libya. So it is a huge problem. It's been building for a long time. You know, it's going to be there no matter whether Merkel survives or whatever, it's going to be there. You know, on the just force, I totally agree with Paul. There's a long history of just war doctrine, theology, and philosophy in virtually every major religion, and it has a lot to do with justification, proportionality. You know, Gareth Evans, the former Australian foreign minister, was one of the leaders, along with Kofi Annan, in developing for a while this notion of the responsibility to protect, which I deeply believed in. It's run into a lot of problems, but it gets at the notion that, you know, do you need to wait until the atrocities happen and then go in and just reduce them, and then also have a country that's very hard to rebuild, or is there a justification? And then who makes the decision, and a whole variety of other things. But I think because so much happens inside states, that this is an issue we'll continue to wrestle with. We sort of thought, we understood after World War II, if one state invades another, that there was a basis for international action. I think Crimea was a big blow to that. But the intra-state issue has been much more complicated, and that's where a lot of the mass atrocities have been happening for a number of years.
And to, I think, both of your points tonight, whatever we can do to avoid the situation deteriorating Absolutely. To that point will save us blood and treasure, and will save a lot of lives in that particular country.
Definitely, yeah. Definitely. No, to the extent you can go upstream and get ahead of the curve, then it just reduces the excruciating decisions that you have to face downstream. So that's the logic of this book.
So Paul Stair's book, Preventive Engagement, How America Can Avoid War, Stay Strong, and Keep the Peace. Thank you very much. It was a great read. I recommend it. And we all know that volume 2 of The Peacemakers will begin with Anwar Sadat. But The Peacemakers, Leadership, is a great book also. I really enjoyed this one. It's not a criticism that Anwar Sadat wasn't in there. The Peacemakers, Leadership Lessons from the 20th Century Statesmanship. And it's not just the case studies, it's also some really outstanding and very wise commentary. So both are available on that corner. The bar is open for another half an hour. Thank you all for being here and for your excellent participation. And thank you, gentlemen, for joining us in Chicago today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.